Hello, everybody. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our discussion of personality disorders in this course on psychopathology. Uh, First off, let's think about how a personality disorder is distinct from some of the other disorders that we've addressed so far, that we've thought about so far. If we take something like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, those are disorders that generally disturb the individual who is suffering from them, meaning that if you have depression, it affects you and you know that you don't like the way you feel when you are suffering from depression. Sometimes the very same thing would happen with anxiety or with obsessive compulsive disorder. You know that there's something that doesn't quite feel right, doesn't quite fit with the way that you normally live your life. In the old psychodynamic terminology or psychoanalytic terminology, we would call something like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder ego dystonic, meaning it doesn't fit with the ego. It doesn't feel right. When we look at personality disorders, it's a bit different. Personality disorders, if we're using that terminology, ego dystonic for things like depression, a personality disorder would be ego syntonic. It would actually fit with the way that the person normally functions, meaning that it is pretty much the way that they are. It's not something that comes up when they come in contact with uh, crowded areas like a mall or confined areas like an elevator if they're suffering from some form of anxiety or social phobia. Uh, it's not just when they come in contact with, let's say, things that they feel would contaminate them. It's something that affects the way that they behave almost every moment of almost every day in every time and every aspect of their life. A general description of a personality disorder would be a lasting and inflexible pattern of inner experience and behavior that would be different from cultural expectations, that presents as a problem in thinking, emotion, interpersonal relationship, and impulse control. And generally it's assumed that this pattern of behavior started from an early age and manifests itself in difficulties either in work situations, social situations, again, interpersonal situations, or perhaps a combination of those different aspects. Now, right here I have the DSM-IV, and we are on DSM-V. That came out in the summer of 2013. So you might think, why am I still holding on to the DSM-IV? Well, the reason for that is because the personality disorder listing and the descriptions given in the DSM-IV text revision are identical to those in the DSM-V. An important point to note when looking at the personality disorders is that they're grouped into clusters. There's an A cluster, a B cluster, and a C cluster. And within the A cluster, there are disorders of personality that have sometimes been called odd or eccentric. So within cluster A, there are such disorders as paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. And the individuals who have these disorders are generally thought of as being just a little bit eccentric, a little bit odd. Uh, their characteristics are a bit out of the ordinary. So cluster A is sometimes called the odd or eccentric cluster. Cluster B contains such disorders as antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder, as well as narcissistic personality disorder. And sometimes that cluster is called the theatrical or the emotional or the affective cluster. the way that people behave is dramatic in those in that classification, in that cluster. So when we think of individuals with antisocial personality disorder, characters such as cinematic villains might come into our minds. When we think about borderline personality disorder, classic cases, or at least in cinema, a classic case such as Basic Instinct with Glenn Close as the individual who has the characteristics of borderline personality disorder. So again, cluster B is sometimes seen as the dramatic cluster. These are people that they make movies about. They're very interesting, at least on film. Perhaps not as interesting in real life. Well, interesting, but perhaps not as enjoyable in real life. And cluster C is sometimes called the fearful or avoidant cluster, because as we look at the names of the personality disorders under this cluster, we see avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And here I want to make a point, even before we go on and talk specifically about obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is not exactly the same thing as obsessive compulsive disorder. It shares many characteristics, but it is a personality disorder. So it's not that the person just has, let's say, a feeling that they have to wash their hands whenever they touch something that they are not used to, or that they have to count the number of knives in a drawer. This is a personality disorder, so it affects the entirety of their personality. Again, it's an inflexible and stable pattern of behavior and thought. And again, that is the definition of a personality disorder. Now we'll go on in other video segments, and of course in the lecture, to talk about these distinctive types of disorders. And I will see you then.